Okay, my name is Larry Rosenthal. I am the chair of the Berkeley Center for Right-Wing Studies. Every semester we have symposia by distinguished researchers in the field. And today is our first such symposium for this fall semester. And I'm very excited at what we're going to be able to learn about today. Today's event is called Germany's 9/11, Neo-Nazis and Right-Wing Terrorism in Germany and their links to US actors. We have co-sponsors, a co-sponsor for this event, which is the Institute of European Studies. And we will follow the following format. I am going to introduce Professor Tanjev Schultz, who is a visiting scholar here at the Center for Right-Wing Studies. And he will talk about his work for about 40 minutes. Then we will have a discussion. And if you have a question, there is a Q&A feature that you please, feel free to make use of. It's really a pleasure to introduce Tanjev Schultz. He is a professor of journalism at the Johannes Gutenberg University in Mainz in Germany. Professor Schultz holds a PhD in political science from the University of Bremen. In his academic and his journalistic work, he investigates the far right and has been doing so for some time. He's written books on neo-Nazi terrorism and German Ku Klux Klan groups. And one of his books in German is called Terror from the Right and the Failure of the State. He's interested in theories of democracy and the ethics of journalism. Professor Schultz spent more than 10 years as a reporter and editor at the German national newspaper Süddeutsche Zeitung, and his reporting there was on politics, education, political extremism, and terrorism. Professor Schultz's journalistic work has received numerous awards in Germany, including the Nannen Prize, the Goethe Media Award, and there are others. It's really been a pleasure to have Professor Schultz as a visiting scholar, despite the limitations of personal meetings with people, which are particularly grievous with Professor Schultz. He's returning to Germany in 2 weeks, so we're very glad to have this opportunity to have him share his work with us today. So on behalf of the center and all the people who are attending this session, welcome to you, Professor Schultz.
Thank you very much, Larry. I'm glad to be here. Thank you for having me. Also, thanks to everyone else at the Institute and at the Center, to Deborah and Sai and all the others joining today. It's a pleasure for me to talk here, even though it's, of course, a very uncomfortable issue, but that's what the Center is all about, I guess. Let me just start my little presentation. I will tell you what I will do. I will just say a few more things about where I come from. Actually, this has to do something a little bit with the things that I will explain later too. And then I will give you an overview on this NSU case. I'm not so sure whether you are at all familiar with it. And then specifically to the links to actors and incidents in the United States. So I just will start my presentation and will, hopefully this will be easy to see for everyone. Yes, I think you can see it now. So this is, yeah, wonderful. This is just a basic map of Germany. Many of you are probably familiar with it, but even I, of course, coming from Germany, do not exactly know where all the cities are in Germany. So it may be helpful for some of you to see where I come from. And also maybe we need the map later when we're talking about the crimes that were committed by the terrorists. So I come from Mainz. Well, I was born in Berlin, but now I live in Mainz and teach there at the university, which is close to Frankfurt, a little bit west of it. You see there the red point. And it's known for its very old cathedral, built around the year 1000, and famous for being the place where Johannes Gutenberg invented the modern printing press. But now it's also known for being the headquarter town of BioNTech, which you all know from the Pfizer vaccine. And now this is already kind of a bridge to my original topic, actually, because the vaccine developers who also gained quite a bit of coverage I've seen in the United States media scene are Özlem Türeci and Uğur Şahin. So you can already tell by the names, they have some Turkish background. And that's an interesting story because, for example, Uğur Şahin, he told in an interview that he experienced some discrimination, one would have to say, in school already. And just by helpful neighbors, he succeeded to go to gymnasium and finally to go to Cologne University to study. And now he's a professor in Mainz. So what you should know about Germany is that when we're talking about discrimination, about racism, and about neo-Nazis, that the Turkish population are the main target group, or used to be the main target group for many years and decades. Now it's a little bit of change there because in the last years we've seen quite a bit of other groups coming from different or various African countries, also from Afghanistan or Syria coming to Germany. So this whole population is changing, but for many years, Turks were the main target population, so to speak, also for aggression from the far right. And many guest workers, so-called guest workers, came to Germany from Turkey in the 60s and 70s, and Uğur Şahin, one of the vaccine developers, was the son of one of these so-called guest workers. So the Turks were really in the center of much of the heated debates going on about immigration in Germany. And Germany, even being a very stable liberal democracy now and developed like this in maybe quite a beautiful way, one could even say, after World War II and the National Socialist regime, it never got really rid of the far-right problem. It was downplayed, in my view, for quite some time. This seems to change a little bit now, I think, but we have to face the facts that even according to intelligence, we have about 33,000 right-wing extremists in Germany, and that number, of course, is just a number that does not really give the whole picture, I think, because that's the way intelligence sources count these people. And we have quite a bit of a death toll. This is really a terrible thing. Depending on who counts that, we have between 100 and 200 victims just when we start at this counting at after reunification in 1990. So we have a severe problem here. That is something one cannot deny. And we just, in the last years, had again really horrible attacks from the far right in various cities like Halle, Hanau, and Kassel. One politician, a conservative politician, was murdered. We had an attack against a synagogue with 2 fatal shots. We had other people, persons of color, being hit and shot. So there is a severe problem we have in Germany. Unfortunately, of course, Germany is not alone with this, but that, of course, I concentrate today on Germany. So we also had far-right parties for many years, especially the NPD used to be around for decades. but it never really managed to be a big factor in the parliaments. This has changed now too with the AfD, the so-called Alternative for Germany, and we will have a national election end of next week. And right now the polls say they will manage to get about 10 to 15%. They used to be higher, so they're right now in kind of a crisis, but that is still quite worrisome because this AfD managed to become quite a factor in German politics. This is just to give you a kind of a background of the German situation. And now I want to concentrate on the NSU case. And it's kind of a provocative thing to compare with 9/11, I think. And I wouldn't have dared to do this myself, just because, well, on the one hand, 9/11, of course, was kind of an example of jihadist terrorism. And secondly, the number of casualties is so much higher than the number of casualties in the NSU case. But still, it was Germany's Chief Federal Prosecutor who in 2012 did this comparison and said, this NSU case is Germany's 9/11. And why did he say this? Well, it was just a few months ago, end of 2011, that this whole case was discovered at all. So the public and the security agencies had no clue that such a terrorism cell existed for years. And this cell, as it turned out, killed 10 people in 7 years between 2000 and 2007. Many more people were wounded in 3 bomb attacks. And this group was also responsible for 15 robberies altogether. This is what we know about this group. According to a criminal court investigation, this group consisted out of 3 persons, but many people of NGO organizations, also lawyers and activists, also journalists like myself and researchers like myself, they suspect that there could be more members of that group, and it is a really big question who was all having knowledge and who helped this group. What is a fact is that there were not only 3 people doing all that, they had helpers, but the question is whether they're really members of this group. Here you see the 10 victims who were fatally shot. And there you can see, just by looking at the names, the first 9 names, they all are either Turkish names, or in one case, 2005, Theodoros Bulgaridis, it's a Greek name. And this is probably why is that? Because we all assume that the terrorists, they just thought he is Turkish, or he was Turkish, but he was not. And the last victim, Michelle Kiesewetter, she's the only female person here. She was a police officer. So at the end, they also shot a police officer. And all the others were Turkish men. The dates, it was here now in the German way. So you see the days first and then the month. And these 10 people were shot. And for many years, the whole investigation was targeting rather the Turkish population. So that made this whole case a real terrible one, because the public and also police and intelligence, they were all on the wrong track. They were actually stigmatizing and criminalizing these Turkish communities rather than going after the far right, which actually was responsible for all this. And that made this whole thing so terrible that in the end, this Chief Federal Prosecutor said, well, this is our 9/11, because what then came to light was also a big failure of the security agencies in Germany. And this is, I just want to show it very briefly, the weapon. It almost looks like a piece of art here, but that was the weapon with which the terrorists shot the first 9 victims. So they always used the same pistol, and that one was later found, that's why it looks that strange, was found in the leftovers of the apartment that one of the terrorists then put to fire. And so you see the leftovers of this pistol. And the other two terrorists of that cell committed suicide in a camper that they used during a bank robbery. And then the female terrorist who was still alive, she burnt down the apartment, and then this whole story unfolded. So that was just at the end of 2011. And what then happened, well, all kinds of things were found, like here, these street maps and city maps, many maps they hoarded in their apartment. They had a lot of data also on the computer files about politicians, about Islamic centers, about synagogues. So it was really an underground cell that we discovered in Germany at that time. They never sent out for the first years letters of confession or claiming responsibility. Just this female terrorist, Beate Zschäpe is her name, she sent then finally out, after she got to know that her comrades had killed themselves, she then sent out DVDs with some films on it, or with one film on it, claiming responsibility for the crimes. And this is a very cynical piece. You know, this film uses the Pink Panther that you're probably familiar with, this kind of a nice character or cartoon figure, and they copied it and made a whole own story. And here you see how they put into that a map of Germany again with all the crime scenes. And so they misused this nice cartoon character. So whenever I see now the Pink Panther cartoons, I cannot stand it any longer. So what unfolded then was a huge investigation. Several parliamentary commissions on federal and state level dealt with this whole thing. So in that way, also comparable to 9/11, because I mean, there are literally millions of files in that investigation involved now, extensive investigations by police and then by the court and by the parliamentary committees, an unparalleled lengthy trial that started in 2030 and lasted 5 years with 438 days of public hearings. And I spent a lot of time being around there and also in these committee meetings at Parliament hearings. And just a few weeks ago, end of August, the court ruling, the decision became final that sent this female terrorist, Beate Zschäpe, to prison for a lifetime. Because there was an appeal, so it took another year, or actually more than a year, of course. It's now almost 3 years since 2018 to make this decision final. So she's in prison now, and with her also some of their helpers. What made this whole thing even more complicated, but also terrible in a way, was that there's kind of what I call the web of spies in the NSU case. So we have all kinds of confidential informants involved in the far-right movement who reported to various police or intelligence agencies in Germany. It's a complicated system. I mean, the US system is very complicated. I get it here too, in terms of very, it's a range of intelligence agencies. And we have a similar situation in Germany with also the different levels. They do not necessarily know what the others do. And so it, here just as a graphical way to illustrate this whole mess is that there were many informants who were sometimes close. We do not know, but how close by far, you know, some even had contacts when this terrorist cell was going into the so-called underground. So the police knew that there were neo-Nazis missing, you know. They searched for them. They did not know that they were responsible for all these crimes, but they were suspects already. And then they did not manage to find them. And then they had some informants, but they probably did not tell everything that they knew. And so this is a whole mess going on that also raised the question whether it's a good idea to have so many informants, making even this far-right movement possibly stronger than it would be without these spies. Thank you for mentioning already the book in the chat. That's one book that I wrote about this whole case, and also together with colleagues from my newspaper that I worked for, we did a 5-volume documentation, thousands of pages about this criminal court case. Because in Germany, we have a kind of an odd situation. There is no protocol of what is spoken in the public hearings on the criminal trial. So we wanted to preserve this for the archives, for investigations, for historians. So what we basically did, we sat there with our laptops, that was allowed, on our knees, and wrote as good as we could everything that was said during that trial, and then edited it and came up with a huge documentation of it all. That was quite a bit of work, and this is also part of the basic material that I can draw on now when looking systematically to my issue of links to actors and incidents in the US. I have not done this in the books I wrote, so that is something that I'm grateful for the time I had here, or I still have here in Berkeley, to go into that, because that is quite a tedious work to do, to run through all the material and all kind of files, and also all the notes, to systematically put together what we know now about possible links to US actors. So that is what I will concentrate now on the rest of my talk. And well, of course, I had this idea in my mind for quite some time, because there was this quote that I mentioned now already by this federal prosecutor giving this link to 9/11. That was by the the investigators' side, but there's also the terrorist side, and then it was striking to hear in court that this female terrorist, Beate Zschäpe, she said, it was a written testimony in that case. For a long time, she didn't say a word, but she said in her testimony that on 9/11, her two terrorist friends, whose names were Uwe Mundlos and Uwe Böhnhardt, they were watching TV like most of us did, and they were cheering and applauding the attacks. And she mentioned that it was not a big thing in court, but it was interesting for me. I thought, well, that's interesting. And she said, well, at that time, because she remembers this being the time when allegedly they also confessed, these two male partners in crime, that they murdered again another Turkish man. And allegedly she had nothing to do without it. I mean, the judges didn't buy that, but probably, well, there's at least no reason to think that the first part of her version of the story is untrue. So it is very likely that this is true. I think that these neo-Nazis were applauding to 9/11. And that is interesting because, well, anti-Americanism is really a part of German neo-Nazism for quite some time. And for example, this NSU cell, they love the band Neue Werte. It's a German neo-Nazi band. And this band, they published a song that was called I don't necessarily need to say it in the full word, you know what this meant, F the USA. And from the very same CD, they took another song for their first version of their film as a where they took responsibility for all the crimes. This is just one example. There are others, like the strategy document by Brotherhood in Thüringen, where the 3 neo-Nazis came from and where they're linked with. There's another document that really shows you that there is this anti-Americanism going on for quite some time. And there it says, well, solidarity with all states, groups, and individuals that resist the imperialistic paternalism of the USA and its vassals. Well, this could also be a left-wing slogan, but of course, this is then combined with anti-Semitism and with all kinds of anti-immigration ideas. And we had quite a number of incidents of US flags burnings by people from the far right in Germany at that time as well. So this all fits together well. And moreover, then I found out that, well, there were at least rumors for an escape plan of these terrorists to Tennessee. You know, they went into the so-called underground in the year 1998. A garage was searched by police at that time. I mean, no murders were at that point committed yet. But these later NSU terrorists, they were already known by police, and they had already done some crimes, or at least there were suspects. And so the police searched a garage that was rented by this female neo-Nazi, Beate Zschäpe. And that was the moment when they all went into the so-called underground, which basically meant that they went to some friends, hid there, and then got fake IDs and rented their own apartments and lived all the time in the eastern part of Germany as they used to. But the police was not able for some reason to find them, which is really a big failure. And they had all kinds of ideas where they hid. And one idea was that these 3 neo-Nazis would flee to Tennessee. And well, they did not, we know now, but it was not that absurd as an idea because as we also know now, police found a letter from a man who formerly was living in Jena, where the 3 neo-Nazis came from, and now lived in Tennessee. And he wrote to these far-right people in Germany, and he expressed his solidarity, and he offered help as well. So that was probably the basis for this rumor. Also, there was an intelligence source obviously involved, but we do not know who and what exactly was the evidence there. Well, in the end, there was no escape to Tennessee, but there were also other material found, like kind of what it was called US reports, written by a US neo-Nazi, also his name was Hans Schmidt, who lived in Germany, and one of the 3, Uwe Mundlos, apparently collected some of these reports. So they dealt with things coming from the far right in the United States. And then we come to the very famous or infamous one, we should say, Turner Diaries. Many of you will know this if you have not read it. Well, you don't have to do it actually, because it's really a very ugly book, of course. But this piece of fiction is supposed to be a novel by US white supremacist William Pierce, using the pseudonym Andrew MacDonald, became very famous not only in the far right of the United States, inspiring Timothy McVeigh, among others, who did then the Oklahoma City bombing, but also was very widely circulated in European neo-Nazi circles. And as we know now, the NSU terrorists had this on their computer files as well. And not only them, but also people surrounding them, some of their helpers, some of which were also sent to prison, or at least they got a they were convicted. So we have kind of an embedment of the NSU and its entourage in an international far-right movement, and organizations such as Blood and Honor and Combat 18 play a role here. We, for example, see also involvement of the very famous German Nazi band Lanza. There are some personal ties that are interesting to the people of NSU. And this Nazi band Lanza that was then prohibited and was seen as a criminal organization in Germany, they produced their music and all their material in the United States. So they had a close contacts to people in the United States. And this also has to do, of course, with the way the law is done. I mean, German far-right has these close ties to US groups because of freedom of expression, is very much more liberal when it comes to National Socialist propaganda in the United States, and much of things that are not allowed in Germany can be done in the United States. And besides, of course, there's also the gun laws, which are attractive for Europeans, the US gun laws in some states. And there are some further references I found now. First of all, there's reference to the terrorist group, The Order, which was around in the United States in the 1980s. And one of the aides of the NSU cell, called André E., he was also part of the court trial. I mean, he was convicted even. And he, at one day in court, ostentatively wore a sweatshirt with the slogan Brüder schweigen in Germany, which means just silent brotherhood, or brothers, they keep quiet, or they keep silent. So he apparently referred to this terrorist group also because we now know that he years ago already came up with kind of a white brotherhood. Together with his twin brother, he published a magazine, the Aryan Law and Order. And in that magazine, they notoriously referred to the 14 words. And these 14 words, many of you will know this. This is one of the white supremacist slogans. The most famous or known version is this ugly slogan: "We must secure the existence of our people and a future for white children." And these 14 words are a reference in many of the articles in the magazine, this fanzine that these neo-Nazis published. And this guy, who then helped the NSU, he was really close to the terrorists. And the prosecutors, as well as journalists and researchers like me, like myself, think he might be much more involved into that activities, but it was not to be proven in the court case. At least the judges thought, well, the evidence is too thin, so he didn't get a very severe judgment in the end. But this is still on appeal, actually. And furthermore, there are Ku Klux Klan connections to be found. Here on the right side, you see Beate Zschäpe in her younger years. In the mid of the 90s, this must have been taken during one of these meetings where they burned a cross. They did not wear these robes in Ku Klux Klan fashion at that time. There was a meeting somewhere close to Jena. But they burned crosses, and they had all kinds of allusions to Ku Klux Klan symbols in propaganda material. And we had some Klan groups as well. Like here, it's kind of a pathetic picture in a basement in Berlin, which have probably had no links to the NSU, but I just wanted to show something that many Germans do not know either, that there has been Ku Klux Klan groups around in Germany for quite some time. Actually, it started already in the 1920s. Here's an old membership card of a group in Germany from the 1920s where something similar to the Ku Klux Klan already was established. And again, here, this web of spies comes into play because at least two of these confidential informants who were really part of the far-right scene themselves, they were also part of Ku Klux Klan groups at some point in time. And this one guy here, he was the leader of a Klan group in the southwest of Germany. And this is really a very complicated story, but why do I tell it or just allude to it? Well, as it turned out, there were also two police officers around the year 2000 or 2001 being member of this Ku Klux Klan group. And the public at this point did not know at all. It all just came out after the NSU revelation. And it then turned out that one of these police officers actually was a close colleague and at one point even the supervisor of the shot police officer, the policewoman that was shot by the NSU. And then there was also another of these confidential informants also being part of this Ku Klux Klan group, and he at one point met one of the terrorists of the NSU. So it makes your head kind of explode if you just briefly mention it. So it was a long investigation by parliamentary members, but also by myself and others. And in the end, we did not find a real connection. So probably this Ku Klux Klan group had nothing really to do with the NSU crimes. And this police officer who was a member for some time at this Klan group, he was not at all involved in the shooting of this other police officer and so on. But nevertheless, it shows you what happens when you start digging. And that is really something that the public had to learn, and which is kind of frightening, that when you start to dig, you find all kinds of connections. And then, of course, all kinds of conspiracy theories are very quickly coming up. And you have to be very careful to be really, really down to earth and sort it all out. But nevertheless, it's terrible enough and frightening enough that you find all these different groups when you start to dig. And this guy here, I mean, he had this whole idea from the Ku Klux Klan because he was also kind of a fan of the United States culture and the Ku Klux Klan white supremacist culture, of course, in that regard. And to tell a little bit of an optimistic story of hope too, he then, a couple of years ago, he dropped out of the far-right scene. He now lives not in Germany anymore, but as a matter of fact, he lives close to Memphis now. And he totally turned to the other side. So he's engaged now in anti-racism. He goes to schools, I think, and so on. I met him in Memphis one day. And at first I was really skeptical whether it's all true and authentic, but he does it now for quite some time. So I think he's really out of it. So this is just a little bit of a hopeful story here too. But this police entanglement, that is something that the German public is really dealing quite a bit now, because after NSU, after this case, there were many other incidents that showed that we have in Germany also a problem in the police and also in some parts of intelligence organizations when it comes to sympathies to the far right or even memberships and all this. So this is these are just some headlines from some of the discussions going on for some time now. And so this is in a way also similar to much of the discussions you had here in the United States in the last years. And that's probably also the reason why in the German public sphere, when, for example, George Floyd and Black Lives Matter movement, that was received quite quite intensively in Germany as well. And young people went to demonstrations. And I think this is also because there was a really similar experiences in a way that people could connect to. Yeah, so let me just come to a conclusion. Well, I have to apologize. This is rather a descriptive, of course, story that I have to tell. I mean, this in terms of research, it's not that much analytical research here or causal mechanisms or so. I just have a hard time to find out what the facts are at that point. It's kind of more of the work of a historian who tries to find out what happens. But nevertheless, I think there are some broader things that are noticeable at that point already. So, well, this may be obvious, but you have to prove it still that US actors and developments have been, and I think still are, very important points of references for the German far right also. So in the NSU case, so I think that is clear now. And maybe we do not know the full story, of course, but there are a lot of, there's evidence that there are these influences, and that there's also, speaking more in general, there's support in ideology, culture, and logistics. I mean, I have not mentioned all of it now because I don't want to go too much into details of all the persons. I mean, it makes you confused. So there are people surrounding NSU, people who helped them at one point or the other from the German far right, who went to the United States for visits, who posed there with guns and so on. So there are connections, even though I cannot prove, and no one so far has proven that there are some, I don't know, US actors who really knew about all this or who were partners in crime or so. Probably there were no people like that, but nevertheless, there are these influences. And not all of it appears really consistent. I mean, it's rather a hodgepodge of influences and relationships, all kinds of cultural elements that are adapted and flow from one direction to the other. And the anti-Americanism is striking, but apparently it's not a big obstacle, or it's not an obstacle at all, because the ideology of white supremacy, along then with anti-Semitism, and also in part then with anti-capitalism and anti-Islam sentiments now, they serve as a common ground to form such an international of the national right of the far right. And this is certainly true not only for the NSU and their and the ground where they were socialized, but also for many other groups of the far right in Germany. So yeah, so this is what I found out also while I was doing my research here, and hopefully you can connect to this in one way or the other, and maybe you have questions or just discussion points. I'd be happy to come into a conversation with you. All right, I just stopped the presentation, I think.
Larry, are you gonna, there we go.
I'm working on it here.
Yeah, there you are.
Okay. Well, wow, that's quite a trip you took us on. Thank you so much. There was so much to what you had to say, and we have some questions. I thought, you've made two broad parallels even in the title of your talk. One is to 9/11 and therefore to the Jihadis, and then to the Americans. And you spent a good deal of your time really digging down and explaining to us what's going on in the NSU itself and in Germany. I want to go back briefly to the connection or parallel you made to jihadi terrorism. And one thing we actually at the center had a number of talks on that several years ago when ISIS was very much in the news and that kind of thing. And one of the things that emerged was how very detailed and sophisticated the online recruitment in the jihadi world was. That finding people, testing them, giving them kind of a succession of mentors to whom they responded. And so I'm wondering, to take up your parallel to jihadi terrorism, is there anything that's been uncovered in the world of something like the NSU which has any kind of parallel to that?
Well, that's a good question. I mean, well, yeah, I don't think there is actually, but what your point is interesting because, well, of course, when the NSU developed, jihadi terrorism was not that big an issue at that point, but they were kind of impressed by the left-wing terrorists. I mean, of course, they were totally opposed to them, but we know that they were interested into the Red Army faction, the left-wing terrorists around in Germany who were really, especially in the 70s, late 70s and also 80s and so on, they committed quite a bit of bloodshed there, and they had very good logistics, I mean, conspirational things, also testing people and so on, that's what you refer to. And we know that at least Uwe Mundlos, one of the NSU terrorists, he was really fascinated by these RAF, the Red Army faction, and the way they managed to do their conspirational work. And they even referred to the Red Army faction in their video, in their film, briefly. But I don't know about a kind of a screening process or like an assessment center, so to speak, for recruiting people, like what you said in terms of the jihadist groups. That I don't know about.
Okay. We have some questions from the participants. I was actually interested in knowing about manifestos and other things they might have published. But Julian Castro-Rey offers the following question. Please tell us more about the NSU ideology and support.
Yeah.
What is the aim of their terrorist attacks? And this question of how can you hate both immigrants and the USA alike? There are then Julian goes on to ask, why did they adopt the Pink Panther as their symbol? So there's a number of questions here, and how widely do you think their goals might be supported in Germany? Is there an institutional or a personal link to the far-right white supremacist groups in the USA, which you begin to allude to? And this is asking, I think Julian is asking, is there something more, as he says, institutional about how it has developed? So that's a number of questions.
Yeah, wow. All very, very good questions, I think. I mean, you just remind me remember me if I
yeah, I got it.
So just beginning maybe with the question of whether, well, what the aim was, or also the
ideology.
The ideology, and this also refers to the manifesto that you said, or that you were interested in. Yeah, one of the reasons why I did not talk so much about it is actually there's not much. I mean, so we have a lot of propaganda material, or not a lot of, but quite a bit of it found in the leftovers in their apartments on computer files and so on. But these were not originally written or so by themselves. So what we do have only is this film. I can talk a little bit about this too, of course. And we know, and that is basically, this is part of their idea. I mean, their slogan was, and this probably answers the question maybe already, their slogan was action, not words. So it's kind of the theory of the deed going on here. And they were not good at coming up with big pamphlets like the Red Army Faction, like left-wing groups and so on. So they may have read like the Turner Diaries and other manifestos where you find ideas about leaderless resistance and the like, and they were probably inspired by it. But they did not at all come up with an own idea, and one really wonders what was their point. I mean, what was their strategy? Why did they? What was the point of killing 9 people with Turkish roots, you know, without telling the public for quite a long time, and then after the end triumphing and saying we were it? What was the point of it? So even people from the far right in Germany, they wondered, and some think it's just nuts. Neo-Nazis thinking. Others, of course, are fascinated by it, and they idolize them. So that is a good thing. And just maybe briefly, this film does not really tell you about this much either. I mean, it just is kind of this cynical way. It's kind of even like this computer game style thing, you know? So, because also someone asked about why Pink Panther. Yeah, I was wondering too. Why did they use this figure? And then it turned out that witnesses say that one of the terrorists, he loved this cartoon when he was young. That seems to be kind of an odd explanation, but maybe that's just it. And there are some other incidents, I don't want to drift too far away, but that tell you that they had some kind of a really cynical humor, and they liked to be that way, to use these things. But they did not come up with really an ideology for themselves. But what we can take out of what they did and what we found is that they really hated Turks, obviously. And they for example, they just numbered their victims, and all were referred to with the name Ali, as a phrase for Turkish people. Ali 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 9. So that is really shows the cruelty, but also and we have all kinds of references already in 1998 when they went into the underground, kind of a poem against Turks and so on. So they hated them, but we also find a lot of evidence for their anti-Semitism as well. And we wonder why they did not go after Jews or synagogues. I mean, maybe there was a point where they thought about it, but they did not do it at that point. And probably they just want to keep hidden for quite some time. And then they were fascinated by the very thing that the police criminalized the victims, basically. So that they must have liked. They apparently enjoyed that. There's some allusion to that in the film as well. So in that way, they fueled what was already there in the German society, you know, in terms of discrimination and structural racism, so to speak, systematic racism. And there were other questions.
I think we can move on, although I would say that in your answer, what's striking is the relative paucity, lack of ideological novelty, and you know, and what you had to say about the Pink Panther was deeply disappointing. Okay, let me move on to Elia Burris, who writes, one reason German neo-Nazis hate the US is they see it as having forced a consumerist liberal democracy onto Germany after World War II. do American neo-Nazis share this view of the USA's post-war role in Germany? In other words, you have these two groups, the Americans and the Germans, who they clearly share a white supremacist ideology and a hatred of liberal democracy. But do they have in common this view of post-war European history, especially German history, that is the imposition of consumerist liberal democracy?
Yeah, I think at least some have. I mean, apparently some of these people, that's why I said there's a hodgepodge. I mean, some, I think, are just putting together whatever they can, which is kind of anti-immigrant, which is kind of white supremacist ideas, and they do not reflect too much about it, how it all is arranged. But some really are into that, for example, anti-consumerism idea. For example, this one guy I was talking about, Andre E., who was very close to the terrorists, and who published this fan sign citing the 14 words, you know. He also cited, or the others in his group cited Tom Metzger, a US neo-Nazi, and in a quote where Metzger said, fighting against something like that, the Coca-Cola culture. And this allegedly superficial consumerism of the United States. So there used to be quite of an influence also from the US far-right, criticizing their own culture, then received by neo-Nazi groups in Germany, who then maybe combined it with what was around in the German intellectual sphere already in terms of anti-Americanism, also fueled sometimes by the GDR official doctrine, by the communists actually. I mean, they were raised, like these three terrorists, for example, of the NSU, they were raised in the GDR. They're from East Germany. They were born 1973, 1975, and 1977. So they were kids still in the GDR and teenagers when the wall came down. And so I suppose, but that's kind of a speculation, that they, of course, were, I mean, there were all these doctrines of the communists as well against America. And then the far right in the east of Germany combined it with their anti-Semitism, their anti-consumerism of the far right. And that is maybe part of the answer to this question. But again, I mean, here we do not have really thorough manifestations in terms of papers or manifestos of these groups.
You know, some American extreme rightists, like neo-Nazis, Andrew Anglin, alt-right figures like Richard Spencer, really look to Russia as you know, one of Anglin called the Russians the strongest white people in the world, and they're the leaders of to the minds of some of these American neo-Nazis of you referred to the Nationalist International. We have a question which says, did the NSU's anti-Americanism correlate to pro-Russianism or Eurasianism a la Alexander Dugin? More broadly, where do German far-right groups stand in general on Russia and other Eurasian regimes?
That's an excellent question. I mean, that is something I have no, to start with the NSU, I have no evidence whatsoever that they had links to Russia or had some hope when it comes to Russia or had ties in that direction. I figure that for them, being raised in the GDR, this was all not what they were interested in. For example, they were really looking to the West maybe at that point of time, but this has changed, interestingly, in the last years. So after the NSU cell, we see quite a bit of that you mentioned here in that question, because I think now there are quite a number of ties. I mean, I would have to investigate that more thoroughly, but from what I read from others and so on, there's quite some interesting ties now going to that direction. And being fascinated also by Russia, also within the German political spectrum, this new far-right party, the AfD, is the only party that really, well, maybe sometimes also the left party, but this far-right party really is kind of, or these parts of this party is kind of sympathizing with the Russia at the moment, and they're visiting people in Moscow, having some maybe interesting affiliations, and even there's talk about money coming from that direction, which has to be proven, of course. But there's something going on, that's for sure. But I just think that for the NSU, that was not a topic at that time.
Okay, it's interesting you alluded to the AfD just now. Here in the USA, certainly post January 6th, but it's been developing. Recently there was a US congressman who in Congress referred to, as the far right likes to say, Second Amendment solutions. But more generally, the relationship between the most extreme right in this country, the militia right, even the Proud Boys, the Oath Keepers, the Boogaloo Boys, it goes on. Their relationship to the Republican Party is becoming greater and greater. There's something called the precinct strategy, where these militias are attempting to take over the party at the very lowest level, the most local level, the precinct level in this country. So with respect to your reference to the AfD, I'm wondering if there is developing any kind of relationship between these groups and electoral parties in Germany.
Oh yeah, there is. I mean, there is, and that is very worrisome. And this used to be the case for years when we speak of this older far-right party, the NPD, but that was just a marginal party, not really having much of a success. There were some other parties around of the far-right. For some time, they had a little bit of success, then they went down again. Same with NPD. They always had some connections to militant groups, militia-like people. But they were not that strong as a party. Now this has changed with AfD. This is kind of a strong party. And there are wings in that party where you can see these connections. That's one can see this. And right now there is really battles going on within this party about the direction they will take. And right now it seems that the development of the last year was just going in the direction that you mentioned, being really quite of a parliamentary force, but also having these connections to really the militia neo-Nazi kind of right. And this is worrisome, of course. On the other hand, in part because of German demonstration laws and so on, it's a little bit more hidden than in the United States, I think. But certainly we have these guys, and you find them then at some party meetings as the people who stand at the doors and so on. So there is this connection, and I think we will not very quickly get rid of it. And we will see end of next week about AfD, what's sure is they will again be part of the parliament. And then they will also get money because they are part of the parliament. They will be able to stabilize their whole infrastructure. And that is something that attracts all kinds of these very militant groups as well, because they can find their ways.
We have an interesting kind of sort of semi-debate in the questions here, and I'd like to read what a couple of people have written and get your feedback on that.
Yeah, great.
James Enriquez says, piggybacking on Julian Castro Reyes' question, I'm really curious to hear how the NSU could reconcile cheering on the non-white 9/11 terrorists with their hatred of non-white peoples. That's one question. Jan Christian Gotcha responds to this that Nazis and neo-Nazis have always admired and collaborated with certain non-white people. The Nazis recruited Bosnian Muslims for the SS with the help of the Grand Mufti of Jerusalem. The Hep Kexel group trained with the PLO, and contemporary neo-Nazis held rallies against the war in Afghanistan, and they wear keffiyehs in solidarity with the Palestinians. In their eyes, they are fighting for national liberation against the Anglo-American empire, and so do the Palestinians, the Taliban, and the Jihadi. So we have this contradiction. We don't like these dark people, but we like the struggles of certain dark people that seem to be more or less aimed at versions of US imperialism, and similarly going back to the Nazi and the fascist period, you got similar things. Is there something in your research which can address these two ideas?
Well, actually, this is really a great discussion, because I was struggling with the same kind of conflict in my head. But I found, I came up with the same, I think, answer that one of the others already mentioned here. There is some certain tradition already. I mean, going back to Hitler, actually, as was pointed out here, I mean, at some points in that time, they tried to mobilize Muslim people in the Arab world, the National Socialists. It did not really work out the way they planned it to, but they tried to. I mean, that was just a strategic thing to do, but you know, targeting the Jews and everything, they were kind of making this this partnership, or thought this could be a good idea. And then Hep Kexel group was mentioned already. We had these connections to the PLO at some points in time of militant far-right groups in Germany, then after World War II. So there is a certain tradition. But I have to say, I think here, NSU, I mean, this has changed dramatically, I think, in the last years. So in a way, maybe this is just the old story, which then stopped a few years ago. I mean, there's certainly still anti-Americanism around in the far right in Germany, but we see now much more concentration not on the Turks as guest workers, but just on the Muslims. So, I mean, it's not just anti-immigration, it's really the Muslim world that is really the new scapegoat, the new alleged enemy. And therefore, I think it probably the reaction now would have been maybe a little bit differently if 9/11 would have happened now, you know. But this, of course, this argument is strange to make, because 9/11 actually was the beginning of this whole new anti-Muslim discourse as well in Germany, but also, as I take it, in the United States. And so in the far right movement, this really has shifted a little bit, I think. And we do not know at all what exactly the NSU terrorists thought about the Muslim world at all. I mean, we know that they shot Turks, but interestingly enough, some of their victims were very religious and some were not at all. So I figure they did not care about this question at all at that point in time when they committed their crimes. They collected data of synagogues, of Islamic centers, but also of kind of secular Turkish community centers. So they were kind of anti-immigration oriented in a very general approach, and did not really differentiate between being Muslim, religious, jihadist, or something like that. So there was just a kind of applauding, I think, because it hit the United States as the imperialistic enemy, and we have to be all freed from this US imperialism. That's what the US neo-Nazis said, right? I mean, like Tom Metzger and Metzger and David Lane and all the others. So they basically stuck to this idea.
We have a question. From what you know, did the NSU cooperate with other far-right terrorist groups in Europe, for example, in Norway, Italy, France, or in Switzerland?
Yeah, that's the open question. I mean, there are many unknowns, and actually, I'm not citing Donald Rumsfeld, many unknowns probably too. We don't know, actually. I suppose there might be at least the idea around that they would have to install a system of different cells loosely connected in some way or the other, but maybe they failed. They simply failed, maybe. We just know that they, at one point very early on in their terrorist career, in about 2001, they sent out some letters and giving donor money to some fan signs, but there was, so far as we know, just for German fan signs. So I'm not sure whether they send out something to international groups. You also have to consider that these three people that were hidden in the underground, I mean, they were raised in the GDR. They had almost no international experiences. They, as we know, once went to the Czech Republic to do some meetings there. But some of their friends, they went to the United States, as I mentioned, but they themselves, they were not very internationally oriented. There was maybe this one Tennessee US plan, then they later came up with the plan that we know for quite sure to escape to South Africa, where they knew people, and where some Germans went. I mean, that was, of course, an attractive state during the apartheid time for neo-Nazis, but that did not turn out to happen. But I don't know about really close ties to any other terrorist groups in Europe.
You alluded again to members of the group coming from the former East Germany. It has been the case since the 90s that, at least in journalistic accounts and in some more scholarly accounts, that the far right in Germany, especially the most militant and perhaps most neo-Nazi right, comes disproportionately from the East. You talked earlier about having grown up, the effect of having grown up under communist rule. Can you comment on, one, whether you think that this, as a general principle, that the far right draws disproportionately from the East is accurate, and why you think that might be so?
I mean, when you look at some statistics, you find some evidence for this position, but I tend to be really careful in generalizing it. Why? Well, not only because I do not want to stigmatize the whole Eastern population in Eastern Germany, but also because I just have to say that there are so many other hotspots in the western part of Germany as well, like in Dortmund, Kassel, Nuremberg, and some other places. And we even can think of the NSU having maybe aides, maybe helpers in these cities, actually. That's what many think. We do not have proven evidence for that, but there are some, that would be complicated to lay out now, but there are some hints, you know, where you think, well, can it be that they all just did it for themselves as just a group of three? Or did they have people who really knew the crime scenes there? I mean, also one wonders, I mean, 3 times they struck in Nuremberg. 2 times they put bombs, they planted bombs in Cologne. Why? At some kind of, one place was kind of really a strange place. So one wonders, but that is only one way to answer this. The other way is that, well, it certainly is a factor. I mean, there were hotspots like where they were raised in Jena at that time when the wall came down. And certainly after reunification, there were many incidents, and many skinheads and neonazis from the East were involved. But there were also many neonazis from the West just taking this opportunity, going to the Eastern part, recruiting people, giving them material, propaganda material, inciting them, and so on. So I tend to be really careful in making too big of a deal in blaming, so to speak, the Eastern part for it. But it, of course, is a factor.
I'm very glad to have you make that clarification. I think it's important that people hear that. I think we are close to a final question here. This is from Kate Fitz. As we in the US see our law enforcement agencies begin to take far-right groups and ideology more seriously and understand the threats it poses to democracy, what lessons should we take from the web of spies and failures of law enforcement in the case of the NSU? What roles can civil society play in creating a wehrhafte Demokratie, or democracy that can defend itself in the United States?
These are 2 excellent questions. I'm maybe just failing to give a really great answer to this. Well, especially to the second one. It's a huge one. I'm not sure. I mean, we all have to just be attentive and in our daily life, but also as academics to just help making our democracy strong. I mean, and that is not only just fighting against the neo-Nazis in a very direct manner or so, but just to make sure that everyone is raised in a way that keeps people away from these groups. And that is just so general that I don't even dare to say it, but I do not have a recipe for that, of course. But when it comes to the security agencies, of course, well, that is really a point, you know. I mean, there are so many amazing and terrible stories I could tell about these informants. And I came up with the impression it's just very risky, maybe just too risky to have this system going the way it did for the future. It just seemed to me in this case that these informants, they made the situation worse. That the agencies thought they have the neo-Nazi groups under their control, but they did not at all. Actually, they made it worse. They made them stronger. I mean, there was tax money pouring into the neo-Nazi group. There were informants kind of being proud of taking the money and spending it for their activities, even paying kind of fines, you know, and all these things. And that is really making people upset. So, of course, then people from the intelligence community say, well, at some point we have to rely on these sources and information, and we would be totally blind if we didn't have these people. Yeah, there may be some cases where this is true, but then you at least would have to make a really honest risk and analysis, you know, and that you do not see, because of course most of it is classified, and it's just good luck and a lot of work to get into the story in that case. And there's so many other cases we do not have a clue about. So I think you can either come to the conclusion, just get rid of all of this whole system, and I have sympathies for that. But then also, of course, I see, well, maybe there are some incidents where it would be really helpful and so on. Anyway, it is not realistic, unfortunately, at the moment for Germany, and certainly not for the United States, to get rid of it. So if that is true, then you would at least have to come up with a system that is empowering the people controlling it. And that is not the case in Germany, at least I know that. I mean, it's really hard to have the parliamentary commissions really getting control of this whole system. And there's a lot you could do to empower members of parliament and so on, to give them more tools to at least try to control all this. Because this is certainly one of the points in our system of democracy where we kind of have our blind spots, you know, where we talk about civil rights and all that, but there are things we do not really want to see and to know about. And so I think from the NSU case, at least you could learn that the system really has failed.
Okay. I believe, one, that we've come to the end of, oops, no, there is one other question here. Norma Alarkan asks, are you familiar with the connections between US and Germany with respect to the eugenics movement of the early 20th century in the US?
Well, I have to admit, no. I mean, at least, I don't know whether you have something specific in mind, but well, if there's something interesting referring to...
Well, it's kind of been established that the Nazis were interested in the eugenics movement in the US in the 1920s and 1930s. And that, and I take the question to mean, is there a continuing interest in that? But as you seem to have suggested earlier, these people are not ideological dynamos.
Yeah, that's so true. I mean, the problem though is that may be also the reason why they were not really taken that seriously for a long time. You know, police and intelligence officers, they used to say for a long time in Germany, well, of course we have violent crimes committed by skinheads, but these are just drunk people, you know, they from time to time they beat up foreigners. I just don't want to ridicule it, but that's basically the way the argument went. And they did not think, because there were not that sophisticated pamphlets out like from the left-wing terrorists, so no one believed that they could do it the way the NSU did, but the NSU did without having all these written ideological pieces out, but just having this stupid Pink Panther film and killing people nevertheless, you know.
Okay. Well, I want to thank you. This has been an extraordinary talk. I also want to thank, which I may have neglected at the beginning, I want to thank the co-sponsor of this event, which is the Institute of European Studies. If I neglected it at the outset, I apologize. But thanks to them, and above all, thanks to you. You know, we've peppered you with a lot of questions because your talk was so compelling and rich. So on behalf of the Center for right-wing studies and the Institute for the Study of Societal Issues. Thank you, Professor Schultz, and thank you to everyone who has attended this. Thank you.
Thank you. It was a pleasure.